Hello, I'm Carol Jago, longtime middle and high school English teacher, past president of the National Council of Teachers of English, and recently elected to the executive board of ILA. In the 32 years that I taught English, I have spent more hours than I care to think about poring over student papers. And I wish I could say that all of those hours were meaningful for student writers. My own journey to think through this process resulted in a book that some of you may know, published also by Heinemann, Papers, helping teachers handle the paper load. So you can imagine how excited I was when I saw that Heinemann was publishing last March Sarah Zerwin's book, Pointless, An English Teacher's Guide to More Meaningful Grading. You know, we can't, as English teachers, we can't work harder. We have to work smarter. So I'm very excited to introduce you tonight to tonight's presenter, Sarah M. Zerwin. Sarah teaches at Fairview High School in Boulder, Colorado, and has over 2 decades of experience in the classroom. Her book, as I mentioned, Pointless, An English Teacher's Guide to More Meaningful Grading, came out in March of 2020. There'll be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. You can submit questions via the Zoom questions box or the chat box, or by posting comments on the Facebook live stream video. Please note that if the chat box conversations become distracting, you can also minimize that area of your screen. If you're tweeting along, please remember to tag ILA at ILA Today and use the hashtag ILA Webinar. If you'd like to rewatch or share this event with a colleague, you can do so directly following the event on our Facebook page. A closed captioning recording will be available within 10 days on our YouTube channel. And without further ado, please help me welcome Sarah Zerwin. Sarah, it's all yours.
Thank you, Carol. Honored to be here with you today. And hello, everybody. Really happy to be with you here today. I am coming at you from my backyard shed in Boulder, Colorado. And I'm very happy to be with you here today. As Carol indicated, I teach at Fairview High School in Boulder, Colorado. Next year, I'll be teaching our 12th grade and our 10th grade language art classes. I've taught all kinds of things in the past, as you can see right there. And I just finished my 25th year in the classroom. So it doesn't seem like it's possible that I've been at it for that long, but here we are. And so today, what I want us all to think about is this, that to engage our students powerfully as writers, we can focus writing instruction on the glorious, messy process rather than on perfect, polished final drafts. And that is, these are the goals that we're going to focus on today to think about that. Considering the potential of focusing our instruction on writing process over products, examining feedback strategies that grow writers, and exploring how to make it safe for students to struggle with the process of writing. So it will be kind of a fast 40 to 45 minutes today, but I will definitely pause for you to do some reflection a few times. You might want to have somewhere lined up to do a little bit of writing as we go along. So, okay. Talk to me, really, truly. You can chat here in Zoom. We can use the chat function as kind of a parking lot for your ideas and questions as they come up. And we're ending today with the Q&A, as Carol indicated. And so some of those issues we can then chat about at the end. If you are on Twitter, I try to attach this hashtag Pointless to any conversation I'm having with readers about the book. So you can check that hashtag out to see about what other teachers are talking about. Here's my email, zerwin73@gmail.com. And you can also DM me on Twitter at Sarah M. Zerwin. I also have a website where you can contact me as well, sarahm.zerwin.com, and resources there as well that I'm trying to build up. So we've got a robust robust set of resources there for you over time. I'm working on it. So, okay, so our first goal here is this one about considering the potential of focusing instruction on writing process over final products. So I recently heard a colleague from a different school talking about how some people in her department thought it was unfair to give students feedback on a rough draft and while they were in process, and then have them continue working and then grade that final draft, because they thought that it was unfair advantage to the students, and also that it would make that final grade not reflective of what the student can do on their own. And for me, this really emphasized that that teacher was thinking very much about that final product and making sure that the grading of that was as accurate as possible. But you all know, writing is incredibly messy and difficult. And there's really no finished piece of writing ever, just a deadline that you need to do something with it. And so writers grow in that messy process space. That's where we should be working on writing with them, is in that messy process space, rather than doing so much emphasis on the final polished draft. So if it's all about the final draft and putting a grade on it, the only way we ever interact with our students is to justify the grades that we're giving, the decisions we're making about grades, to explain why we took the points off or gave the score that we did on the rubric. So that's not exactly the place that I want to be. It doesn't support writers as effectively as we can. So I've got a couple of items here. I think I only have time to talk through one of them, but what does it look like to focus on process over product? And so from my 12th grade language arts class that I teach, I wanted to show this to you today, a revision of a piece of writing that's very, very emphasized on process. I have really been trying to figure out, what does it mean to focus on process instead of product when you're dealing with students, student writers in a classroom? And so here's what I've been trying to do. And I'll try to point out to you where the process pieces are coming up in this. So it's a revision of a piece of writing is what the task is. And my students, we did this in the spring, and we had kind of a truncated semester because of our COVID pandemic year scheduling, but we'd done 4 drafts, and then I wanted them to revise one. So the first step here was for them to let me know, just highlight which draft have you chosen, what's the genre, etc. And then step 2, I asked them to find a new mentor text. Using mentor text is something that I teach my students to do with every piece of writing, and they already had a mentor text for the original draft that they did, but I wanted them to find a new one to guide their revision work. And so here at this step, I'm getting them into that piece of the process where you turn to some other pieces of writing to help see some ways that you can improve what you're working on. And so I have them, like, here's the mentor text you found, explain why you chose it, then explain the craft moves that you're going to use from that piece. And I'm drawing directly there on Writing with Mentors from Allison Marchetti and Rebecca Odell, which is a wonderful resource if you haven't looked at that. And then the next step after they've found a mentor text is I ask them to find some reader feedback, and I put them in pod groups in my class, and they can turn to the people in their pod groups for feedback, but I also invite them to find any reader out there in their life that they think would be a good source of feedback for them on a piece of writing. And here on this document, I have them articulate for me, who was your reader, what's the most important bit of the feedback you got from them that you're going to use in your revision work, and what about my feedback on the rough draft that I gave you on the rough draft, what feedback are you going to use from that? So this is me trying to get them to articulate, get some feedback, and then really think carefully in that part of the process, how are you going to use that feedback to improve your work? The next step is revise. And here I asked them to copy the text from their paper, their original, and paste it in between the 2 lines here on this document, and then make all the revisions here and turn on suggesting mode in Google Docs so that I can see every change that they make. And then I asked them to put some comments in the margin to explain their thinking to me about the changes that they are making. After they've done that, I want them to do some proofreading. And instead of me going through and marking the paper up before the final draft is done so that it doesn't have any errors on it at all, I have them open up this document, which is a list of common mechanical errors that students have been doing in the papers. and have them take a look at this and pick a few of these errors and try to address them in their paper. And you'll notice that I've got links to resources for them. So at that step of the process, they can do that as independently as possible. And of course, I do definitely step in to help them as they need when they're doing that. And then finally, after they've done that proofreading step, I have them write a reflective memo to do some thinking over the whole process and where it helped them grow as writers. So this is the kind of thing that I'm coming up with for my students to really have the work that we're doing in class focus on process more than product, because they have to show me very explicitly all those different steps of the process. All right. So how does that example I just showed you get students focused on their own writing process? There are two key components here: choice and frequent invitations to reflect. And I really try to embed choice whenever possible so students can choose the focus of their work that they're doing with their writing in my class. And so with that, what I just showed you, they chose a piece of writing out of several that they wanted to revise. They chose who would give them feedback. They chose a mentor text. They chose which mechanical errors to address. And each opportunity for choice creates more and more ownership over the task as they work through it. Those frequent invitations to reflect along the way, as you saw, help them pay attention to where they are in their own learning and growing. It was reflect on the feedback you've gotten from readers and explain what you want to address as you write. Explain why you chose that mentor text. Think about what you want to work on in the future and explain. And all of those opportunities to reflect help them, again, pay attention. Where are you as a writer? Where are you learning and growing? And in the reflection, one thing I also do is I ask students to connect the work to their individual learning goals. A key component of my classroom assessment is having students set their own learning goals off of the goals for the course. And my book goes into much more detail and depth about that process. But asking students to set their learning goals based on the course curriculum, objectives, and then inviting them to reflect on those goals frequently has really done more toward focusing my students on the process rather than product than really anything else that I have done. So let's take a quick 1-minute pause. And this will be the first of a few of these. I would like for you to think about a piece of writing you currently use in your classroom and think about how you might shift the focus to process over a final product, or look for places where you're already doing this and where you could do more, or consider the reasons within your school and or district that make it seem difficult to focus on process rather than a final product. And I invite you to write on your own or put a sentence or two of your thinking in the chat for us to consider in the Q&A. So I'll stop talking and start the timer so you have a good minute to just do some reflecting. I'll be back with you in a minute. Okay, thank you everybody for doing that. And just a few things I'm seeing in the chat, the Google Doc that I just showed you, those are the kinds of resources I want to compile on my website for people to make use of later. And someone also was wondering if this was only for high school students. The example I gave you was out of a high school classroom, but you know your students best, like take bits and pieces from what I'm talking about and figure out how to make them meaningful if you're not in a high school setting. So that's, I hope that there are ways to do that for sure. So, okay. The next goal here to talk about is to examine feedback strategies that grow writers. And the writing work invited by that task I just showed you requires a classroom community that centers on feedback. You probably noticed the places where the tasks ask students to work in their pod groups or to seek out a reader for feedback. to help them figure out how to revise. And it takes some targeted work to build a community that supports that kind of collaborative work on writing, so that you've got a space that really supports all of it. And this is really, really important to think about. You are not the only person in the room who can give writers the feedback that they need. And in fact, students need to write a lot more than one teacher can read and respond to alone. I'm going to say that again because it's really, really important, and it's to remind me as well. But students need to write a lot more than one teacher can read and respond to alone. It is not possible for us to give them response on the volume of writing they need to really grow as writers. And so by nurturing a positive feedback culture in your classroom, your students can help you manage the feedback load. I have 4 steps to follow that I follow to build that kind of a community. So let's take a look at those. The first one, it's really scary to share your writing. And so even scarier to do so with people that you don't know. So time spent at the beginning of the year getting students to know each other, getting students comfortable with each other is really worth it. I do a whole class community builder every day for the first week or so, plus small group conversation tasks that get students connected with each other. And I'm sure that you've got a lot of great things that you do as well for this. So you're certainly welcome to drop them in the chat to share with everybody who's here about the things that you do. But I don't know if you're familiar with Liz Prather's books about teaching writing. There's project-based writing and also Story Matters. They're both really wonderful about teaching writing. And she has in both books a bunch of community building activities that are also great for getting students thinking about what to write about. So I turned to her sections of those 2 books to just get ideas when I'm working on this piece in my classroom. So for example, this is one of her ideas, and it's called Campfire. And or fire pit, she calls it the fire pit, sorry. So what you do is you sit the students in a circle, and I put a video of campfire up on the screen, like something like this, and just so we can kind of set the mood a little bit. And then we just tell stories. I mean, you kind of have to get them started. I start by saying to the students, all right, so I've got a couple of stories I could tell you, one about the ghost in the house where I grew up, and the other one about the weird things that have happened between my mom and her twin sister. Which one do you want to hear? And then somebody will yell, ghost or twins or whatever, and then off we go. I'll tell the story, and then another kid will tell a story, and then another student will tell a story, and before we know it, we're just sitting around and telling stories. And what Liz Prather reminds you to do is to every so often look at a kid and say, hey, do you think that's something you could write about? So you just very naturally remind them that they're coming up with topics that they could possibly write about, and maybe jot it down in your writer's notebook or whatever. And this is something you can do with the whole class at once. You also can have students do it in small groups as like a small group community builder, or you could have them do it in small groups and choose one story to tell the whole class, which I have done with success definitely in the past as well. So I love that one a lot. And then here, this is something that I do just to inject a little bit of silliness in my classroom. I call it dino challenges. And these are just run-of-the-mill plastic dinosaurs that you can order off the internet. And I will put out an academic challenge or a silly team building challenge, and the group that wins the challenge gets the dinos. And it's so funny how hard high school kids will work for a little tiny plastic dinosaur. And they name them, and sometimes they come to class every single day. Sometimes they like glue them on their car dashboards. I even had one student who made an Instagram account for her dinosaur. I have got photos of the dinosaurs on vacation. It's kind of crazy how much the kids love this. And I mean, you could come up with whatever version of that would work for you, but for me, the plastic dinos have been kind of genius. And this in the top right corner here is the photo of the air purifier that took up residence in my classroom this year. And I had a dino challenge for the group that came up with the best name for the air purifier. So I got some big googly eyes and put them on him, and we named him Carl. I'm sure Carl will be back in some shape or form this next school year. But anyhow, another thing that I like to do is group selfies. Can we call them groupies? I'm not really sure, but it'll be some challenge, and I'll send the kids out in the building to take some photos as a group. And here the challenge was to take a picture somewhere on school grounds that represents something everyone in your group has in common. And then they post it to the group, the classroom page. And then the rest of the class tries to guess what it is that they have in common or whatever the task was. Often I'll award dinos for our favorites. And even during online instruction this year, we still were able to do this. They could take groupies just of their breakout rooms, and that was a lot of fun. And in the case of this, I would actually mail the dinos to them in the mail because we weren't in the classroom together. This was from a part of the school year that was completely, totally online. So fun. And wisdom from some students at a faculty meeting this spring. We had a group of students present to us asking for us to do a little more intentional work to bridge the gap of connection with online learning. They asked us for, quote, unstructured connection within structured time. In other words, opportunities for chit chat, which of course, when you've got a completely online classroom or a hybrid online in-person classroom, it's hard to have those opportunities for chit chat for the students who are online. However, I think it's really important, and they presented some research to us that said the benefit of chit chat was making friendly noises at each other. Isn't that beautiful? I really, really love that, making friendly noises at each other. But it reminds me that once, I hope that I will be back with all my students in person in the fall, and I still have to be very intentional to make space for them to make friendly noises at each other, to grow the connection in the classroom so that we are all able to be a community focusing on writing. So my next step is that I teach students about feedback. And these are some principles that I have my students copy down into their writer's notebooks. And while they do that, I talk about each principle briefly as they do. And this goes a long way towards shifting students' perceptions about peer feedback. I find often they're not fans of it when they get to my class, for various reasons, from like, I just want the teacher, because you're the expert, to give me the feedback, to I don't trust my classmates to give me good feedback, or to somebody who was mean in the past or whatever. So I've got to work very intentionally to help reset their understandings about feedback. As I go through these, I talk to them about, like, when I'm responding to your work, this is how this shows up. And they've already gotten response from me by the time I'm doing this in class. And so they can anchor on that. And then we also revisit this list a few times during the school year to come back to and say, like, what do you need to work on? What could you strengthen? How are you doing as a feedback giver in this class? And then I also, when I teach students about feedback, I give them some feedback frameworks. And I've got two: I heard, I noticed, I wondered, and also respond as a human being, respond like a reader, respond as a writer. These are in my book, these frameworks are, but here's the document that I give my students about this. And I got one of these from a book, and I got one of these from Middle Web online, and they're both really, really wonderful. And you may notice, especially with the second one, that there are sentence stems. Like, we can't assume that our students know how to talk effectively with each other about writing. We really need to help them out with that. And what I like to do with this document is have my students tape it into their writer's notebook, and then do some highlighting on the document about what, like, is really jumping out at them as a really great way that they might phrase their feedback or approach their feedback when they're giving feedback to others. I also will maybe do things like, hey, everybody get out the feedback frameworks. Let's work on responding like a reader today. So everyone pick one of those sentence stems from there and use that when you're doing your feedback giving today in class. Another thing I do about the time that I'm teaching my students about how to talk about writing is I'll invite a colleague to come in to the room to have a feedback conversation with me about a piece of writing that I have done. And in that conversation, I'm able to model for the students, my colleague and I are able to model for the students what it means, what it looks like to talk about a piece of writing. And I often will step out of the conversation and turn to the kids and say, hey, did you see that sentence stem that we've been talking about? Or did you see, did you see, I just wrote a note down in my writer's notebook, and here's what it is. Like, this is the thing that jumped out at me from what he was saying that I just wrote down. So I try to kind of let the students in on the thinking that's going on with that whole conversation as we go through it. So teaching students about feedback is my next step in the process. Then the next thing I try to do to build this community that focuses on feedback in my classroom is share the feedback load with my students. And my book runs through each of these in much more detail, so I'm not going to go through that today in a lot of detail, but there are lots of things that we can do to have the students share the load with us so we're not carrying all of it. And in the case of numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 as well, you're teaching students strategies that they can use again and again and again on their own to get feedback on their writing without needing you to be the one sitting there doing it for them all the time. And anything we can do to help students be self-sufficient as writers, I think is really, really important. I do want to talk about number 2 briefly though, which is use a checklist or rubric to guide peer feedback in small groups or for student self-assessment, and consider the single point rubric, which is genius. Just Google that if you're not familiar with that, it's genius. But anyhow, you can, like, if you have a required rubric that you're supposed to use, you can like use it for this and use it for the kids to guide their conversations with each other or to guide their own self-assessment of their writing. It can work incredibly well for that. Like I use the AP Lit rubrics in my AP Lit class as a conversation piece to guide the students' conversation about their writing with each other. I just don't put the rubric score in the grade book as a high stakes grade that calculates into anything, because then it makes it less meaningful, I think, and makes it more about emphasizing the final product rather than, hey, you're on a process as a writer. Where are you right now? How it went now compared to where you were before? And if you don't have a rubric, then I also work on making checklists with my students about the writing that we're doing. This is one that my students made when we were studying the genre of commentary. And the process we went through for this is we read a bunch of commentary to start out with to get a sense of what the genre was, and then tried to kind of define the genre. And then they tried writing one on their own. They tried finding a mentor text to help guide their work. And after they've been doing some work with the genre, then I said, okay, guys, let's make a checklist together that defines this genre. And like, what's a good commentary? What does a strong commentary have? And this was all in the students' words. This is their language. We only spent maybe 10 minutes in class building this together. They talked, I had them talk in a small group and then share out with the class. I took notes on the big screen. And then we ended up with this checklist that the students can use to guide their own work with each other on their drafts, or to guide their work with their own work on their own. So I'm a big fan of that. And finally, the last piece of this idea about building a classroom community that focuses on feedback is to work more efficiently when you give feedback yourself. And one thing that, like, the more years I put in, the less I am able to stare down a stack of papers. I just can't do it anymore. So I've been, just out of mere survival, I've been coming up with ways to make my stacks of papers smaller. And one thing for me, due date schedules, I'll make a sign up sheet for students and have, like 6 papers come in on a day. I could get through 6 papers really in a really healthy way and give kids really good feedback. And then they get the feedback back really fast. And so that's one thing that I've been doing, rather than getting all the papers at once, just having them trickle in, and then talking very honestly with the students about what it means for me to give them that feedback, and how it's really important that if whatever deadline they choose, they've got to hit it, because I'm planning time to work with their paper on that day. And then another thing too, I've been learning about this idea of white language supremacy. And it comes from the work of, there's lots of people talking about it, but Asao B. Inouye is the one who has really gotten me thinking about it. And you can go online and find a PDF copy of his book called Anti-Racist Writing Assessment Ecologies. Highly recommend, for sure. And in that book, he talks about, makes a really strong argument that any rubric that we have is most likely couched in a white racial framework of understanding language. And because of that, it makes it very difficult for us to see all of our students' language use clearly. And so what he does to sidestep that, so he's not using rubrics to assess all of his students' writing and being unable to see it clearly, is the grading he does, he calls it labor-based contract grading. And he is a writing professor at an Arizona university. And he'll tell his students, if you want to get a B in the class, you have to do like these 7 assignments. If you want an A, these 2 of the 7 need to be longer. And then he just spends his time responding to their work, giving them feedback, and teaching them actually how to do the work. Like, how much time should you be spending on this piece? And what does it look like to talk with each other about this piece? and all of that. So he just sidesteps the whole issue with using rubrics that are couched in a dominant like way of using language to assess all students when that doesn't allow us to see them clearly. And so what I do thinking about that is like, I really want to catch, like, where am I exerting the power of the red pen over my students' use of language? And there are a couple places. One is when I fill the margins with lots of comments, I've noticed that the students will just go from comment to comment to comment and just use it like a checklist of things the teacher said I have to fix about this piece of writing. And that is me like exerting power over their writing. And I don't want to do that anymore. I do still once in a while, if I think it's the best way to give the student the feedback, I do point out specific places, but I'm really pushing myself to do just a paragraph at the end where I give them a few sentences of reflection about what they could possibly address as they revise. And then they have to look at the paragraph and think about their whole piece of writing and make a decision about, what of this feedback do I want to use? And then the other piece is I've like stopped marking errors on papers, because that is really a place that we can exert the power of the red pen and also force a certain like way of using language on our students. I would much rather teach them like how to use and understand the conventions of language for their own purposes so that they have the power of the language rather than me exerting that power over them. So when you saw in the example I gave you for my classroom, the revision assignment, I have them like, here's a list of common mechanical errors that I'm seeing collectively in your papers this year. Pick 2 or 3 of those and try to address them in your writing. And if you have a hard time with that, then let me know. I would be more than happy to help you figure out how to work on any specific area of that. So those are a couple of things that I've been trying to work on. And those make me more efficient, because now that I'm not marking all the errors, that speeds me up enormously, right? And now that I'm also like really trying to catch myself and just write a few sentences at the end of response, that is faster than doing a bunch of line comments. So it is enabling me to work more efficiently when I give feedback, and I think it's more meaningful for my students. All right, time for another 1-minute pause. So write again to capture what you're thinking about cultivating classroom culture based on feedback and managing the feedback load, and or put your thoughts or go-to strategies in the chat so we can learn from each other. I'll go ahead and start the timer and give you a minute to do that. Okay, thank you. One more topic here, and then we'll be ready for the Q&A. So here's our third goal: to make it safe for students to struggle with the process of writing in our classrooms. And so the community building that I discussed already, of course, as a foundation for a classroom based on feedback, is relevant to creating safe spaces for our students to struggle with writing. But there's a lot more that we can do. And I think that this really comes down to grading. So I've got a little bit of a thought experiment for you. So find some place to do some writing, paper, blank doc on your computer, whatever. But don't put this in the chat. I'm going to ask us all to put something in the chat at once in a little bit. Don't put this part in the chat. But with each of the next 4 slides, jot down words or phrases or doodles that capture your response, and write quickly, because we're not going to be on each slide for very long. Okay, are you ready? Here's the first one. Imagine you just got this paper back from a teacher. What do you notice? How do you feel? How excited are you to keep working on the piece of writing? Okay, this one. Imagine you just got this paper back from the teacher. What do you notice? How do you feel? How excited are you to keep working on the piece of writing? Now, how about this one? What do you notice? How do you feel? How excited are you to keep working on the piece of writing? It says nice handwriting up there in the corner. That's what it says. And finally, look at this rubric. It's really okay for these purposes that you might not be able to read it very clearly yet. This is one of my past rubrics, but what do you notice? How do you feel? And how excited are you to use this rubric to guide your work? Look over what you wrote and mark the words that jump out at you most immediately. 1 or 2 or 3 of them. I'll give you a few moments to think about that. And we're going to do waterfall chat. So choose those 1 to 3 words, type them into the chat, but don't hit enter until I count us down so everyone's response hits the chat at the same moment. So a few moments just to work on getting your words typed and ready to go in the chat. All right. On the count of 3, let's all hit return. 1, 2, 3. And just take a look, everyone, at what we have there. Yeah. Thank you for playing along with me, by the way, with the waterfall chat. Okay, good. Thank you. Let's keep moving here. So what we just saw there was a focus on final product over process, an emphasis on final product over process. And the final product emphasis was really from a traditional grading standpoint, and the process, what I'm trying to get to is a more differentiated approach to assessment. And so traditional grading, here's what I mean by that. Emphasis is on final products. Teacher evaluates student work toward external standards of quality. All students work towards mastery of the exact same standards. Classroom orbits on an exchange. Students earn points for doing work possibly tied to a rubric. Those points and rubric scores calculate into an ever-changing grade, and the teacher has all the power. In a differentiated assessment classroom, emphasis is on each student's unique process. The teacher responds to student work with feedback meant to grow writers. Students set individual learning goals and monitor their own progress and growth. And if done pointlessly, as I go through in my book, the classroom orbits on the work of learning. Students get feedback on their work from the teacher, from peers, and even from themselves. Students write to capture their learning and growth when they select a final grade, and students have agency over their learning. I put those together on one slide here, just so you can see the contrast between the two, products versus process, evaluation versus response, growth, mastery versus growth. And I think this is so important, because in one stance, the teacher has all the power, and in the other, students have agency over their learning. And if students are going to be enmeshed in the messy process of writing, they have to feel that agency. They've got to feel safe to struggle with the writing, and they've got to have that agency over their work. So here's a big question for you to think about. And this is a question that came up in a conversation that I had recently with one of my assistant principals. And her question wasn't about writing, but it was about, like, where might your grading be punishing students who are struggling? It's for us to think about, where might traditional grading punish students for struggling with their writing? I think it's really important to be thinking about this a lot and make sure that we are not doing things with our grading that end up punishing our students for struggling with their writing, because the struggle is incredibly important. So I don't know if you're familiar with this book here, Craft in the Real World by Matthew Salaces. I don't know if I'm saying his last name right or not. I apologize if I messed it up, but this is a really awesome book and you should pick it up. Rethinking Fiction Writing and Workshopping. So it's really all about fiction writing. And in the book, he redefines craft terms. But I think that this book is actually really good for classes that study works of fiction as well, because that redefinition of the craft terms, for example, gives a new insight and lens into thinking about books. And his redefinition of conflict, for example, is what's relevant here. And he defines it as what gives or takes away the illusion of free will. And he asks some questions that you should ponder about a character. And they are, what is the character struggling with? And how much of that struggle is the character's fault? And what else might be going on to create that struggle for that character? And I tried these questions with my students when we were studying Beloved this spring, and it got them deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the big issues that underpin the book. Okay, what does this have to do with our students as writers? Well, I think those questions are really good. Like, what is the writer struggling with? How much of that is the writer's own fault? What else might be going on to create that struggle for the writer? Like, these are questions we need to understand and know about our students. We can only do it when we're enmeshed in the process with them. And an evaluative stance makes it really difficult to see this struggle clearly, because we really do need to be able to see our students and where they're struggling. This is an important shift to make with our approach to grading in our classroom. An emphasis on process and feedback over evaluation of final products shifts your focus from mastery and evaluation to growth in students actually doing the work, not like just sort of complying to get the boxes checked, but actually doing the messy work of being a writer. It's a really, really important shift. And I have to tell you, it's a shift I have been struggling with myself, because I have been taught for 2 decades that as a teacher, my grading is supposed to evaluate my students' mastery of standards, and that the grades are supposed to be accurate and reflect something very particular, but in an evaluative sense. But I think it's okay for us not to do that anymore. And here's some reasons why. The assessment experts are moving away from measuring mastery toward measuring growth on learning progressions. They're trying to figure that out. How do we measure the progression and growth of student learning? They've been working on that for a decade. Mastery is impossible to capture well when it comes to writing. Like, you know this, you've mastered like some aspect of writing over here in this setting, but then over in this other writing setting, it's a completely different ballgame, and it doesn't necessarily, the mastery doesn't necessarily transfer. A focus on mastery suggests to students that they can be done with certain skills as writers. This just isn't true, right? It's just not true. We're never done with skills as writers. We have to continue working on them. After years of point collecting behaviors, students need an intervention, and making the shift so that you're not emphasizing the points and the final products and evaluation of those, I think helps the students to understand what the actual work of doing writing looks like. So I think that's really important too. It's an intervention for them. I refuse to rank and sort students to perpetuate the oppressive nature of grading. I talk about this in my book. I do a brief history of grading and trace it back to its origins. It's been about oppression from the beginning. Anytime we rank and sort our students on a scale, we are telling some that they are better than and some that they are less than. And I don't want to contribute to that anymore. So I just don't want to do it anymore. Other parts of our assessment system measure mastery towards standards. In my state, in Colorado, we do the PSAT and the SAT in high school as our required state test. We also, at my school, we have a lot of students doing AP exams and IB exams. All of those exams measure achievement of standards. So I'm not sure that classroom teachers have to do that as well. And I think that an evaluative stance gets in the way of the teaching and learning relationship that we need to have with our students to really help them grow as writers. And making the shift is better for our students, and it's more sustainable for me. Like, my job has become much more sustainable ever since I did make the shift. It's better for teachers, for everybody. All right, so, and the shift is really critical to build writers, very, very critical. Authentic writing is messy. Writers struggle in the process. That's what it means. Like, to be a writer is a struggle. It's an absolute struggle. Sometimes writers fail while they're struggling, and that's all part of the process. A writing classroom must be a safe place for students to fail. We've got to do that. If there are grades attached to students writing, it's not a safe place for them to fail. They fail and there's a consequence. They fail and there's a consequence that has consequence for them, right? Because the grade is going down. And I'm guessing you may have more thoughts about this. My book does a much deeper dive on all of this. And I'm also doing a one-day workshop in November that goes into more details about this as well. Okay, this is our last 1 minute pause, but I do want to give you a minute just to pull your thinking, just to stop and think for a little bit, how you might shift your focus more toward feedback in the process rather than evaluating final products. What are your concerns and questions, or where do you sense any obstacles to this? And then write and think on your own, or drop some thoughts into the chat. So let me start the timer for you. And then we're going to be heading towards the Q&A momentarily here. Okay, so just to remind you how to continue talking with me, because I would be happy to, the pointless hashtag on Twitter to see what other teachers are, the conversation I'm having with other teachers about all of this. Email or DM me on Twitter. Go to my website to look for resources and to contact me and various things. And also I'm doing a one-day virtual workshop in November, and you can get to that information about that, tinyurl.com/pointless21, and case sensitive, I think. So anyhow, thank you for being here with me today, and it's time for the Q&A, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, Heinemann, for making this conversation possible. And one of the things that just strikes me so powerfully is the extent to which we as writing teachers have been mistaking our role and thinking that we're copy editors rather than writing teachers. And I just keep thinking about how many teachers that sends out of the profession. And we really need to work smarter. We can't work any harder. So there have been so many questions. One that was raised is, Sarah, what do you recommend about how to use this process of focusing on process without students tiring of the same routine with each assignment? How do you change it up?
Yeah, that's definitely a great question. And I had another assignment to show everybody that was very different from that revision assignment that I showed you that does get students in on the process. When I did a run through earlier today, it was clear I did not have time for it. But yeah, that's a good question. And I think it kind of depends on the task, and just think about ways like what are the process requirements of this task that I could get students enmeshed in. But that's also, on the other hand, like those steps of the process, right? The reader feedback and the seeking out a mentor text and all of that, like that's the work that writers actually do. And they don't necessarily do it in a linear fashion, but those are the things that writers do. And I think that we help our students quite a bit by teaching them the things that actual writers actually do. And so whereas it could feel repetitive because they're basically doing the same work again and again and again, it's all on different pieces of writing. And it is the work that writers do. So
it's interesting, Sarah, that because what you're saying about the work that real writers do brings up a question that several people had, which is, but what happens when you ask students what grade they should get and they all say they should get an A? And then their hearts are broken when you disagree. How do you deal with that with real life students who are themselves in the process of becoming real life writers?
Yeah, great question as well. And that's a very common concern that I hear from teachers. And I hear you, I do. Like, it's really scary to imagine that you can turn over that really important job of determining what the grade's going to be to students. And yeah, it's scary for sure. But I have to tell you, like, I have found that my students are incredibly fair and accurate. I've also found that sometimes I have fewer A's than I used to when my students are choosing their own grades. It has to be, my book like goes through the whole process that works for me to build a classroom where students can do that with fidelity, really, to be honest about their work and assess their growth and their progress really, really clearly and honestly. They can do it. And that doesn't mean that I don't sometimes have students who are just like, hey, I get to do my own grade, I'm going to just make it an A. But what I often find out, and students will tell me, I thought this class was going to be easy when I heard that I was going to be choosing my own grade, but how wrong was I? I was so wrong about that. And so it's really interesting, but there is a huge leap of faith there, a huge one, and it's real. It is scary to set aside all those things that we do to typically in traditional grading to get to grades.
Well, this reminds me of a passage from your book where you write, I want my students to practice writing so that they are able to write a future for themselves within all this human complexity. I want them to craft a voice, to contribute to the conversation, to pull together their stance and articulate it effectively, no matter what the purpose or audience for their words. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what do you mean to write a future for themselves?
Yeah, thank you. This really underpins my whole philosophy for teaching, highly inspired by the work I did with Paulo Freire's work when I was in grad school, for sure. But there's this idea about, like, we do literacy work in our classroom so that students learn how to read the complex world we're in and be able to write their own existence in it. And I think whatever we can do to help students have agency over their voice in our classroom actually translates to them having agency over their own lives, really, truly. It's not, we teach writing, yeah, but I mean, authentic writing is about like a human, like shouting out into the void about what matters to them and who they are and who they want to become. And that's the kind of work I want my students doing in my classroom. And that is absolutely critical to their ability to do that for the rest of their life.
And that relates to another question that Christine had about, can you elaborate a little bit more about the peer feedback circle strategy? Because it seems to me about when you talk about doing things for their own lives, we do things in collaboration with others. Maybe there are a couple of poets who work in a cave, but most of us, even as writers, there's a whole lot of collaboration along the way. How do you help nurture that in your students?
Yeah, there is a lot of collaboration along the way. And writing is kind of an interesting thing, right? I mean, there is a lot of just like your butt in the chair and just getting the work done, right? There's a lot of lonely hours on writing, and students need to have the perseverance to do that. But you're right, Carol, like we also write in collaboration and community with people around us. I have an editor who's helping me with my work. I have at school, I have colleagues who help me with the curriculum that we write together. And so we do have to, as writers, we do have to most definitely be able to work in collaboration with other people around us. And so in my classroom, all of that team building, I put them in these response groups, these pods, and they stay there for weeks so that they can build relationships with those people. And that was so critical during online teaching this year. In fact, I asked them, like, who do you know in this room already that you would be excited to show up to in a breakout room with? So I could leverage those connections they already had with each other to be connections in my classroom. But yeah, I try to breed these little tiny writing communities so that they just walk in the room, they're like, hey, can you look at my intro? Or, hey, I wrote a poem last night. Can you look at it really quick? So that they're naturally turning to each other constantly for that collaborative feedback. And the feedback circle you brought up is a strategy from my classroom where like you just put the kids in a big circle and they each have a draft. And I used to do this, you know, back years ago when they weren't writing on Chromebooks all the time. And so they would have, you know, paper, actual pieces of paper. And I still do this sometimes and have them print. And they just like pass their papers around and they look at someone else's and they give feedback. And it's like this beautiful, lovely circle of people who are all working on each other's writing together. It's wonderful.
What an amazing image for us to come close on. We're just about out of time, and I want to thank everyone for joining us, listening in, your wonderful questions. And a big thank you to you, Sarah, to get us all thinking, particularly at a moment when we have some space to rethink our work and try to do things differently. For those of you who are interested, Sarah's book, Pointless, is available to buy now from Heinemann. Use the coupon code CONF21 at online checkout for a special discount on the book when you purchase it at Heinemann.com by June 30th. Thank you again, Sarah, Heinemann, and ILA for a great webinar. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be available directly after on our Facebook page. We have a few upcoming events that I'd like to share with you. On Wednesday, July 14th at 5 o'clock Eastern, join us for Tackling Tough Topics through Middle Grade Literature. In this ILA webinar, 4 middle grade authors, Barbara D., Supriya Kalar, Henna Khan, and Donna Gephardt will discuss the importance of using fiction to introduce tough topics to middle grade readers as part of a moderated conversation led by educator Tuan Nguyen. This panel will cover social emotional learning and how to address difficult subjects such as divorce, drug addiction, childhood cancer, and cultural identity in a sensitive way. Please keep an eye on the ILA Digital Events webpage, literacyworldwide.org/digital events for additional on-demand content and upcoming webinars and learning opportunities. In case you missed our recent ILA webinar with Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul, we ground ourselves in critical literacy pedagogies and explore writing about reading strategies that support students' powerful expression of ideas. We try on critical literary lenses such as positioning, microaggressions, power, and resistance, and apply them to various texts. And by doing so, we can support students in reading, analyzing, and evaluating literature and their own lives. In case you missed our recent ILA webinar with Glenda Martinez-Tay, we discuss how teacher expectations directly affect student outcomes. We'll also explore how to increase equity in education, address implicit bias, and have open dialogue about how we can change our outlook on student abilities. If you're not already following ILA on social media, make sure to do so for the most up-to-date information. Thank you again, everyone. And I hope you've learned as much as I have from Sarah. You've been amazing.
Thank you, Carol. It's been an honor to be here with you, really, truly. Thank you, Carol. And thank you, ILA, for the opportunity.